Namah Shri Atirajaya Vivekanandasure Sachet Sukhasvarupaya Swamine Tapaharine. So we were discussing this lecture, Freedom of the Soul, which starts off with the Mahavakya from Chandogya, Tattvamasi, and then traces the philosophical development through the different schools of Vedanta particularly, starting with the dualistic schools, Advaita, and he basically says in the previous paragraph where we concluded our discussion last time, that very often, I mean most of the time, the dualistic schools are resistant to questioning. Yeah, I mean essentially it's they suppress the voice of questioning, and an analytical inquiry is often not something that that finds favor with such schools. Yeah, it's substituted by this word, this expression called faith or Vishwas, which is a bit of a misnomer, because we have a belief in the fact that the world exists. Yeah? So how about starting with something as fundamental as that? Something which is incontrovertible, something that is a system that is or if you want to call it a belief system or a system of conviction, that's shared amongst most people. And what these schools, in the previous lecture we concluded it here, which is basically what he said there was that when suffering comes, it is our duty to endure it patiently. If we do not, we shall be punished all the more. How do we know that? Because the Vedas say so, and thus they have their texts and their meanings, and they want to enforce them. Yeah? This certainly subscribes to a particular kind of mindset, but that mindset does not really have too much to recommend itself. It's basically an uninquiring mindset. And the first sutra of this Brahma Sutra Bhashya says, Atha Ataha Brahma Jigyasa. So this desire to know. Desire to know what? Desire to know the truth. And what is the mechanism towards it? It's fueled by the spirit of enquiry. That's the questioning. Questioning with an aim towards finding the truth. And it is exactly here that the scientific temperament, which is what brings us even our day-to-day benefits today, it's that spirit, the scientific spirit, namely that truth, both external and internal, is worth finding out, this value, and B, that it is something that belongs to all. This dual spirit of science, directed towards the inner organism, is what jigyasa is about. But the dualists typically, they try to stifle this voice of enquiry and replace it by a belief system, a rather elaborate belief system, most of which is somewhat speculative. I mean, after all, if you are defending something or you are trying to put forward something that cannot withstand enquiry, then you have to build a rather convoluted system. Yeah? So that's what happens here. Basically, instead of saying that, look, we don't know the answer to these questions, you go on developing trying to put one unexplainable and replace it by, or put some explanation behind it by another unexplainable. It's not satisfying to the mind that is A, after truth, and B, takes the mental faculty of enquiry as a way of arriving at it. Okay, so it's not very satisfying. It's not very sophisticated, not very satisfying, and certainly does not appeal to this craving in the human heart for truths. It somehow stops that inquiry. So, but that's how it is. See, after all, if you consider the primitive man, or primitive human beings, not living in society, they would be told by their ancestors or their father or grandfather or mother or elders in the society that, look, if you go this way, there is a certain danger of some wild animals eating you up. You don't ask questions there because your life is at stake. So certainly there is a place for that. But on the other hand, here, when we have settled down in societies and there's a certain basic measure of equilibrium around us, and we are trying to ask for something more basic, more fundamental, then inquiry needs to be cultivated as an essential tool. And that spirit of inquiry is not satisfied, not met with by these dualistic schools. So we come to the next class of Vedantic schools, and this is called qualified monism or Vishishta Advaita. Vishishta Advaita means Advaita, it's non-dual, but it's qualified by some things. This is what Ramanuja, one of the other acharyas of Vedanta, came up with. Okay. So there are others, we'll start here. There are others who, though not admitting the Maya theory is what is brought up by Advaitins. Yeah? We'll come to that at the end, and we'll try to address a certain question that was raised in the chat last time about what exactly is the domain of causality. Afterwards, because that's much more sophisticated, and really the context for that is non-duality. There are others who, though not admitting the Maya theory, stand midway. Midway between what? Between this naive dualistic way of thinking and the non-dualistic Advaitic way of thinking. They say that the whole of this creation forms, as it were, the body of God. God is the soul of all souls and of the whole of nature. See, here, what they're trying to do is they're trying to unify. Yeah? It's basically saying that there is nature, there are these beings, they're not really separate, but they are part and parcel of one supreme reality, conscious reality, which we call God. In the case of individual souls, contraction comes from evil doing. When a man does anything evil, his soul begins to contract and his power is diminished and goes on decreasing until he does good works, when it expands again. See, here is a key point in Vishishtadvaita, that this ethical system is tied inseparably to the quest for the supreme reality. And this brings in this notion of good and bad. These were formulated, you must know, at a time when these ideas of evolution of species were very far in the future. So people did not really have a scientific understanding of even the human being as an organism. I mean, today, for instance, this kind of idea would be met with lots of questions. So, for example, the basic question, see here, what is being talked about is that the basic idea of Vishishtadvaita is the following, that there are all these individual souls who are part and parcel of a great reality which is called the soul of all souls or God. And so nature is also a covering of that. And God is the soul of nature as well. It is a step towards unification. But then, how do we proceed towards that reality? By going on doing good works, so that the constriction or restriction that we have of this little hole called our little individual soul, through which we gain access to reality, that expands or contracts with deeds. What will happen subsequently, once you start understanding this non-dual or Advaita Vedanta, or if you prefer Madhyamika Buddhism, is the following. What we call good or what we call bad is not an end in itself. It is something that is defined in terms of our quest for something ultimate. What are we looking for as Advaitins? What is it that we are after? It is a total extinction or removal of duality. So then, what is the impediment towards it? The impediment is this sense that one is different from another. This sense of duality is the impediment. And so, what acts would be conducive towards a non-dual perception? Acts that erase in our subjective consciousness the difference between you and me. Hence, recognizing that the same truth is there in the person in front of me or in the object we are trying to study and oneself would be a practice of going towards that non-duality. That act would then be called good, basically because it allows us to progress towards this truth of non-duality, undivided consciousness. What would be bad? That which in our consciousness creates divisions between a person and another person. Yeah? Hatred, anger, fear are the passions that naturally cause this division, and therefore we use this short word bad to label these feelings, because this is what prevents us from going towards the truth of non-duality. Very often I come across people as, oh yes, all this non-duality is very fine, but that is at the ultimate stage. But now what are we going to do? Now we are going to indulge ourselves in all this anger, hatred, fear. This is a certain intellectually dishonest practice. Yeah. Why? It's basically because instead of saying that, look, I cannot practice this because of certain limitations in me, I keep on trying to justify those feelings to myself and say that, no, it's perfectly all right to have hidden or otherwise these feelings of anger, hatred, fear, and therefore otherize certain others. Yeah? Give them some label that you don't like, put it on somebody else, and then refuse to acknowledge that this person in front of you has the same fundamental right to being as you do. So, viewed from the Advaitic lens, good and bad are not something that are in any sense absolute. What is good is something that allows you to proceed towards this undivided consciousness. What is bad is that which makes your consciousness or makes your psyche more and more fragmented. Yeah? This is then the definition of good and bad. And automatically then it will not be something that is absolute. Certain societies will say that, okay, these are these are conducive to a larger undivided consciousness, and some will say that something else is. And so, the notion of good and bad becomes dependent on this basic quest for an undivided consciousness. On the other hand, Vishishtadvaita does not go that far. Vishishtadvaita does not go that far. Yeah? What it does is it defines good and bad in terms of contraction and expansion of the soul. What they're trying to do is exactly the same thing. However, they are not philosophically going to the point of saying that, look, there is the only truth is this one undivided non-dual consciousness. Okay. But it's proceeding towards that. I wanted to say this basically because these ethical concerns sometimes turn out to be things that we load ourselves with. Which means basically we give ourselves this axiom that opening the door with the left hand is bad, with the right hand is good. You ask something, there are no questions, and that question is not to be addressed. And we give values to it. This is good, this is bad. What Advaita forces us to do is examine that act and ask, is this going to help me towards this goal of undivided pure consciousness, where we do not recognize the difference between the other person in front of me and myself. There is no otherization. All right. One idea, and so at this stage, Vivekananda takes off and brings in the core idea between all of these. One idea seems to be common in all the Indian systems, and I think in every system in the world, whether they know it or not. And that is what I should call the divinity of man. There is no one system in the world, no real religion, which does not hold the idea that the human soul, whatever it be, or whatever its relation to God, is essentially pure and perfect, whether expressed in the language of mythology, allegory, or philosophy. Its real nature is blessedness and power, not weakness and misery. Somehow or other, this misery has come. The crude systems may call it a personified evil, a devil, or an Ahriman, to explain how this misery came. Other systems may try to make a god and a devil in one, who makes some people miserable and others happy without any reason whatsoever. Again, see, this is a throwback to the pure dualistic schools, which are kind of mindless, and so there is a god, there is a devil, there's some presiding deity of good, there's a presiding deity of bad, and sometimes this one wins, sometimes that one wins. There are no reasons. We are not supposed to ask any questions. This is a ridiculous, it's basically a philosophy of mindlessness. So essentially saying that don't exercise your faculty of reason. It's not relevant to this discussion. Others again, more thoughtful, bring in the theory of Maya and so forth. Maya is a philosophical theory, which means basically we have not lost any of our perfection, but only in terms of appearance there is something that has happened, and this principle which clouds is what is called Maya. It's essentially a certain detachment, intellectual detachment comes about, and we remove from ourselves this excessive emotional investment in a theory and bring it out so that we can look at it in a calmer, more detached way. But one fact stands out clearly, and it is with this that we have to deal. After all, these philosophical ideas and systems are but gymnastics of the mind, intellectual exercises. See, here, after having talked about the divinity of the individual soul, he says, look, these philosophical doctrines and their cogitation about that is not what is important. At this fundamental level, they are just pieces of intellectual gymnastics. I like that theory, I like this theory, etc., etc., which means one is lost. I mean, there's a very real danger there. We try to understand these various intellectual structures and think that that is what we are after. And what we don't get is that, look, this understanding is supposed to lead us forth towards truth. And the good is defined in terms of progress towards that truth, not in terms of this shell which is the intellectual belief system. The one great idea that to me seems to be clear and comes out through masses of superstition in every country and in every religion is the one luminous idea that man, this is written in the late 19th, early 20th century. So by man he means human beings. That human being is divine, that divinity is our nature. And here he finds the unifying thread between the real Advaita. Yeah, not Advaita just as a school of philosophy, but as a way of life, way of thought, way of acting in day-to-day life. Yeah, that despite all the superficial belief system different people profess, whether they claim to be dualists or qualified monists or Advaitins, all of them subscribe, whether they are Hindus, Christians, Muslims, Buddhists, Jains, all declare, or Jews, all declare that the core of our being is, for want of a better word, divine, which means unaffected by good or bad, unaffected by misery. This core is what is being subscribed to by all religions, and it is that towards which the intellectual superstructure of Advaita is a finger. I mean, it points a finger towards that experiential, experimental reality. And what we are supposed to do is experience that, move towards that in terms of our day-to-day experience. What superstructure we put on top of it is of secondary importance. At this stage, philosophical subscription to an ideology, to a theory, etc., all becomes secondary. Now, this brings us to this key fact. What really is divine? What does it mean? And here is the thing, the way Advaita or Madhyamaka approaches it, is essentially says, aham pratyaya gocharaha. The one piece of datum in our subjective world, in our experiential world, that we have no doubt about is my own existence. This is what's called, what in Vedanta calls aham pratyaya. Aham is me, and pratyaya is the conviction, I exist. Now, this is what is aham pratyaya gochara? What is the reality towards which this raw universal experience points a finger to? Start there and inquire into it. This is the sum and substance of it. All of the rest of religious pursuit boils down to this simple datum. And catching hold of it resolves all existential problems by the way. Now, I would like to relate this to this very perceptive question that had been posed on the web in the light of the discussion from last time. We had been discussing basically this notion of causality and causation, and this framework, space-time and causation, through which we understand. And we had described as an instance that this sudden emergence of clarity in our mind, or a sudden understanding of depth and beauty in something, is not something that we can really catch hold of in this causal framework. I should qualify that statement. As of now, meaning as far as our scientific understanding of the human psyche is concerned at the present moment in our evolution, we do not have a causal framework within which to catch hold of this particular phenomenon of this sudden emergence of clarity while pursuing a problem or something that we are not able to understand, and then it suddenly emerges. And so that is a placeholder within our psyche of something that's acausal. But then what is causal? What can be studied within the framework of causation? And it is essentially this, that anything that we objectify, that we can put out there and study from a third-person perspective. See, this table is in front of me, this chair is in front of me, and I can study it, I can look at it, I can gain knowledge about it, and that knowledge can be passed on to another member of the species. That is essentially the domain of third-person data. Third person meaning I am an observer, I am communicating information about something outside of me. What is undefined in this process is the me. But whatever that me is, there is something that is within, namely the subject, and there is something that is without, that is the object. And anything objective, which is what we are calling third-person data, is something that can be communicated to what we call another person. And this is the domain of space-time and causation. All knowledge about this is to be conveyed through this framework that we unconsciously or consciously adopt, namely the domain of causality. All third-person experience is the domain of causality, in some form or the other. It need not be deterministic, it could be probabilistic, it could be stochastic, it could be uncertain, and so on. However, a causal framework necessarily comes in there. What is left? As soon as we talk of a third-person experience, we are really talking about shared first-person experiences. This is the paradox of the situation, that each of us experiences reality in a direct way. We have a notion of reality, and our minute, moment by moment experience registers it. And that which is experienced as an object of experience is third person data that we share, and understanding that is always through this framework of space-time and causation. After excluding all that, what is left is this pure, subjective, first-person experience. That is not caught in third-person data. That I am experiencing is not something that we can possibly doubt. Yeah? So there's this famous thing of cogito ergo sum of Descartes, but it's essentially, I experience, I mean, the right statement in the Vedantic terms is, I experience, therefore I am. Yeah? This is the Sat dimension of reality, which is there with us at every moment. This experience of the Sat, of isness, of truth, of beauty, in every moment is not caught within the framework of reality. That which is, so very roughly to summarize, third person experience is the domain of, or third person explanations, discussions, knowledge is the domain of space-time and causation. First person experience is not. This is roughly the dichotomy that we. And so, the mechanism or the instrument by which we investigate these two dimensions necessarily are different. And here is where this idea of Maya, or in Advaita Vedanta, at an individual level comes into play. Shankara, in his introduction to the Brahmasutra Bhashya, calls it adhyasa. See, it's essentially, we have this, in this discussion itself, we've been talking about the subject and the object. Yeah? But then where exactly is our I? Is our self-consciousness? It's somewhere in the middle of these two. It confuses the pure subject with the pure object, and that confusion, that mixture, is what we call, I am experiencing such and such, such and such, such and such. Can we separate it out? This is the final viveka that is expected to be done in this process. Yeah? What is common in my experience today, my experience yesterday, my experience of this, my experience of that? What is this that is experiencing? Yeah? When one directs one's mind towards that subject and proceeds in depth, then that is subjective inquiry. Asking the question, what is universal in this process of subjective inquiry? I look at another person, I assume that that other person experiences reality largely in the way I do. What is common to that experiencer there and this experiencer here? Yeah? And the culmination of this inquiry is supposed to be this, one of these Mahavakyas, Aham Brahmasmi or Tattvamasi, with which we started this essay, started this lecture of Vivekananda. So I think that should really answer that question that that was posed. What exactly is the domain of causality? What is the domain of, what is something that is acausal? And I had mentioned last time that this flash of clarity and understanding, and this, so we read a piece of poetry, somehow suddenly it moves us. Why? Because it brings a lot of our conscious or unconscious mind together in one flash of awareness. And that is something that cuts through the framework of space-time and causation. And so we can take that as a placeholder for something that does not lie within this experience of space-time and causation. Because as soon as we put that experience outside us and we try describing it to another person, What have we done? We have converted first-person experience into third-person data, and we are sharing that with another person. At that stage, space-time and causation and causality as a framework of understanding has come into play. But at the instant of subjective experience, it is not there. This is the basic point that we are trying to clarify here. So hopefully that addresses the question from last time. Okay. So then, once you have this understanding that, look, there is this subjective reality, which is what we call experience, and there is an objective reality, that which is experienced, and every act of cognition, understanding, emotive reactions, and so on, is an interaction between these two dimensions, the subjective, pure subjective, and the pure objective, and this relation between them at every instance defines our empirical I. This raw data, this aham pratyaya that we were talking about, at every instant is generated by this interaction of this pure subject, which is not causal and hence not caught within the framework of space and time, and that which is experienced, the object of experience. And this interaction generates automatically, or is, I think this pratitya samutpada of Madhyamaka is actually very useful here. It's somehow or the other, it's generated by and generates. So it's this rise of this empirical I and these experience of this interaction between the subject and the object are things that we can separate out intellectually as two different things, but there isn't really a strict causal relationship, but there is a correlation. One generates the other generates this. So the empirical I comes up simultaneously with this interaction between the pure subject and that which is outside. Okay. So once we have that clarity, we can now try to get this tool of knowledge which is there in our hearts to study both that which is experienced and the experiencer. It is the analysis into the subject, into the core of one's being, that requires an introspective, analytic intellect. And that which is into the object is what we typically call the scientific intellect, or or we just refer to it as the intellect. But that's really a misnomer. It's the same buddhi. It's the same buddhi either directed outward towards object of experience or directed inward towards the subject of experience. And once one starts probing it deeper and deeper, what happens if objective information is what we are trying to understand, then what happens? The knowledge that is there in diverse, many observed phenomena, that starts revealing itself. The unifying principle behind various objective phenomena start revealing itself. This is the principle of knowledge. This is what gives rise to laws in nature. Laws in nature, you don't find the law of gravity as an observed object. What happens when the human being tries to understand these diverse phenomena of things attracting each other and detects there is a principle which unifies all of these, that we call the law of gravity, and then we carry around with us this very simple thing, the law of gravity, and that explains diverse phenomena. What has happened is that we have taken multiple objective observed phenomena, distilled out of it a piece of knowledge. That flash of knowledge is now encoded in something that is mental, which we call the law of gravity. What are we after here? Direct that same analytical intellect, which means our feeling, willing, and thinking unified together, but in order to study a different phenomenon, again something that is common, namely the existence of this I. Not through third person, but essentially refining the first person experience. Yeah? It's basically asking ourselves, see, suppose somebody tells me that, oh, your I thought is something that is born out of your brain in such and such a way. What is the end of such a thing? What it will do is it will tell me that, okay, there is this I thought, there are these causal frameworks through which we can pass on some aspect of this I data to another person. We can do this third person analysis of this I-ness. But is it going to be something that is immediate as the experience of our I is at this very moment? It won't, because it's going to be trying to put this immediate experience of I exist into some kind of a third person intellectual framework. It cannot possibly capture that immediacy of experience. Therefore, what is the solution if we really have to get to grips with this problem? Is take that same instrument. Don't try to say that, look, there is only this external causal framework for studying this phenomenon, but say that, look, there is this framework, there is this way of understanding which is analytical. Take that same tool, the analytical intellect, along with all our subjective capacities, and refine them by directing the same faculties towards this subject. This is what is called an inner direction of these faculties, which is why, once you get this point, you understand, look, it is because of this particular object of study that all these various disciplines are something that we are told to practice. Then the practice becomes meaningful. Oh, we are after this truth, therefore there is this other things that we need to practice, because it's conducive to that inquiry. And I, as an individual seeker, am committed to that inquiry. If this subjective conviction is there, if this subjective commitment is there, then we don't need to go around saying that, oh, so and so has said this must be done. Why? Oh, it is many people have done it before me, therefore all this anushasana, as it's called in yoga. This anushasana goes, and it is led by this fervent jigyasa, this desire for truth. It automatically fuels these virtues. We don't have to separately cultivate virtues in order to make our minds receptive towards this truth. The very fact that the mind wants to understand the truth behind the subject automatically leads to what we call virtues without necessarily having to consciously cultivate them. So we'll return to this next Saturday. Om Shanti Shanti Shanti. Hari Om Tat Sat. Shri Ramakrishna Arpanamastu.